and more death sentences are being deemed as being imposed in an unviable manner, in a manner that is not consistent with the law. And that should really worry us. There seems to be this narrative that higher and higher punishments for sexual violence is the response, and that's the way to go. Harsher punishments are not going to reduce sexual violence in our society. If you are in certain states for certain kinds of crimes, you're more likely to get the death penalty than if you were in other states. Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh are the states of interest, really. In the annual statistics for the year 2021 that we are reporting now, the big news is that the number of death sentences has doubled from 2020, the 144 death sentences imposed by the trial courts this year. And as a result of that, the total death row population at the end of 2021 is the highest it has ever been since 2004. So there is clearly an increasing trend of more and more death sentences. And if you look at the numbers, they have been steadily climbing over the years. I think that if you look at the statistics over the last 6 years, except for 2020, trial courts have imposed more than 100 death sentences easily every year. And actually, in 3 out of those 6 years, it's almost more than 150 every year. But every year, we also see a fair number of high court decisions that either commute or acquit death row prisoners, and that usually then ends up balancing out the total number of death row prisoners. But this year, what we have seen is a very high number of death sentences by the trial courts and a much lower rate of adjudication amongst the high courts. So a combination of those two factors, high death sentences in the trial court and far fewer decisions from the high courts, has resulted in this large death row population at the end of the year. Compared to 2020, the trial courts have imposed almost double the death sentences this year. Of course, 2020, I guess, was affected by the pandemic and the courts were not as functional. But you can see once the trial courts have resumed functioning, how immediately there seems to be a jump to very high rates of death sentences being imposed by the trial court. So, it must be worrying that we are not seeing, the pandemic in 2021 does not seem to have slowed down the rate of death sentences at all being imposed by the trial courts. And that must worry us as to how those processes are playing out really in the trial courts, that despite all the various difficulties, death sentences, difficulties in the legal system, the death sentences continue unabated. I think Uttar Pradesh, traditionally has been, because I guess by virtue of just population, right? It's you see the larger number of death sentences. But I think Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh are the states of interest, really, because Uttar Pradesh, as I said, you have to look at it in proportion to the number of crimes or the population and then look at that. But Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh have been traditionally very high death sentence states, right? And that's another part of the problem with the death penalty in India, right? That you will see that if you are in certain states for certain kinds of crimes, you're more likely to get the death penalty than if you were in other states, right? That, like for example, in the formerly united Andhra Pradesh or even now, no death sentence has been ever confirmed by the High Court in over 20 years, right? So whereas in Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, you see a large chunk of the cases coming to the Supreme Court being death sentence cases from these two states, right? So in that sense, it again speaks to another aspect of the arbitrariness of the death penalty, that if you happen to be in a certain state, you're far more likely to get the death penalty. If you look at child sexual violence and crimes being prosecuted for that and the convictions in those cases where murder is involved, and now with the amendments in the POCSO where murder is also, where there is no murder and it is child rape, there seems to be this narrative that higher and higher punishments for sexual violence is the response, and that's the way to go. Of course, it's couched in the narrative that higher punishments might reduce crime, and anybody who knows the realities of sexual violence in our society, be it against women or be it against children, will tell you that harsher punishments are not going to solve this problem. But yet, that seems to be the rhetoric that's playing out, and the manner in which sentencing procedures are given a go-by in these cases is something that the Supreme Court has commented on repeatedly last year in 2021 in almost four judgments that they have said about how courts are not doing the things that they ought to be doing while sentencing people to death. So therefore you see this a sense of almost retributive justice operating in these judgments, where if there's a certain kind of crime, judges seem to be more inclined to give the death sentence in courts below, which are just not being upheld in appellate courts. So clearly there is an exaggerated use of the death penalty, right? And apparently for the reason that, we need harsher punishments, but we all know that harsher punishments are not going to reduce sexual violence in our society. Clearly, more and more death sentences are being deemed as being imposed in an unviable manner, in a manner that is not consistent with the law. And that should really worry us, that because people are then being forced to spend many, many years on death row unnecessarily when the law has not been appropriately followed to sentence them to death. Everyone in the system understands it's broken, right? Including the Supreme Court, that the manner in which death sentences are imposed are so broken. And that's borne out by the statistics over whatever period you want to look at, 20 years, 10 years, whatever, 5 years, that there is an exaggerated use. The only solution really is to impose a moratorium and stop imposition of death sentences and take until a very close look is taken on how death sentences are being imposed and what has happened with the imposition of death sentences and where have been the problems. And the only way to do it and to do that examination is to impose a moratorium and say that death sentences are not going to be imposed until that very close, thorough examination happens. If you don't impose a moratorium and then just say, oh yes, you all understand there are problems and those problems need to be solved, but we're still going to go on imposing death sentences, it just means that we are more than happy as a society to let people undergo that suffering of being on death row unnecessarily.